Hello, my name is Anastazia Schmid, and I'll be presenting Sexual Conquest in 19th Century Institutions, Dr. Theophilus Parvin's Captive Patients and His Connections in Medical Science. In 1886, Dr. Theophilus Parvin presented a lecture to medical colleagues on nymphomania and masturbation, the twin specialties for which he was internationally renowned. He apologized for not being able to bring before his audience a 42-year-old widow whom he examined because she complained of excessive desire for sexual intercourse. When in this case we noted the irritability on the introduction of the finger, we applied muriate of cocaine to the clitoris, and I can assure you the effect was wonderful. The vagina at once behaved as well as the most virtuous vagina in the United States. This case illustrates several critical facets of experimental 19th century gynecological medicine, and by spotlighting a central figure in the field and some of his less savory practices. Yet Dr. Parvin is largely missing from the historical record that more fully discusses his predecessor, Dr. Marion J. Sims, the father of gynecology in the U.S., and Parvin's successor, Amos W. Butler, one of the founders of eugenics in America. Also missing are the context of Parvin's experimentation and where he perfected his craft. Showing Parvin to be the bridge figure that he is underlines their shared projects of social control and the subjugation of women's bodies by patriarchal institutions, as well as the myriad ways these men and their practices correlate to modern female medical science and institutions of social control. I contend that the medicalization of all women's bodies is a form of sexual control, which in turn provides leverage for social control. First, I will briefly introduce our three protagonists, the context in which they worked, the women they victimized, and the ways in which they were linked to one another. Dr. Marion Sims haphazardly fell into the treatment of women's diseases after being called to attend to a woman who sustained a pelvic injury from a fall off a horse that required him to examine her sex and reproductive organs. He placed his female patient on her hands and knees while opening her vagina with spoons to examine her. Chronicling his unprecedented medical procedure and discovery, Sims proclaimed, "I saw everything as no man had seen before. The speculum made it perfectly clear from the beginning. I felt like an explorer in medicine who first views a new and important territory." Sims' voyage into uncharted territory sent him on a medical conquest of female sexual reproductive anatomy. With this practice originally located in the antebellum South, Sims found his experimental medical subjects in black female slaves, whom he operated relentlessly without anesthesia. In 1855, he opened the first women's hospital in New York, catering to lower-class women, predominantly Irish immigrants, where he offered free surgical treatment to indigent women. He and his hospital were backed by the New York State legislator, the lieutenant governor, the founder of the New York Times, among other political and economic elites. Only a decade after the war, Sims was elected president of the American Medical Association, where he helped found the American Gynecology Society, a group exclusively membered by men. A fraternal cult of gynecology was born. Sims' medical advances and his choice of experimental subjects mark a pivotal point in the subjugation of women's bodies, particularly in the experimental use of vulnerable populations and in American approaches to institutions of social control. I now turn to our second protagonist, one of Sims' aspiring colleagues, Dr. Theophilus Parvin. In 1873, Parvin accepted the position of head physician at the nation's first women's prison, the Indiana Reformatory for Women and Girls. In 1876, he, like Sims before him, was elected president of the AMA. Parvin's physician's notes in the annual reports are short and erudite, exemplifying the many ways he advocated for prisoners' health and well-being. Yet in only one of his many publications in medical journals does Parvin mention his patients at the prison, and obituaries and biographers fail to mention his decade at the prison at all. We have three types of evidence regarding what he may have been up to at that time. The first are news accounts of the 1881 legislative investigation of abuses at the prison that took place 8 years into Parvin's tenure. partially regarding punishments used by the prison superintendent, Sarah Smith, in response to inmates masturbating. Masturbators were locked in solitary confinement and waterboarded, and Dr. Parvin clearly approved. He testified at the 1881 hearing that no punishment has come under my notice, which I think was cruel, though he went on to disclaim that he personally had not prescribed there should be an application of water upon prisoners for certain diseases, a direct contradiction to his 1875 journal publication where he prescribed cold shower baths to a 16-year-old prostitute at the reformatory for urinary incontinence. Among those who testified was Mary Jane Schweitzer, who had frequently found herself in trouble at the prison and whose punishments included waterboarding and the following description of a forced operation of unknown nature after one altercation. I was visited by Dr. Parvin. I was very sick and he was to examine me with instruments. Mrs. Smith on that occasion dragged me out of my bed and into the other room. I told her what I thought of being treated that way. Dr. Parvin said I was to lie in bed for several days after the operation. The sinister implications of Mary Jane's statement only becomes clear when we examine the second type of evidence, Parvin's own clinical lectures about the appropriate treatments of nymphomania and masturbation. He defined a nymphomaniac as any woman who has sexual desire, even married women. Parvin believed that women only submit to sex as a duty. He explains his method of clinical diagnoses thusly. When I subjected this woman to examination in the presence of Dr. Morris, I found some peculiar phenomenon. When the finger was introduced into the vagina, as soon as the clitoris was barely touched, there were produced irregular movements of the hips and pelvis. As the finger was advanced, the muscles about the vagina were thrown into a state of contraction, which it closed tight on the finger, and this caused a sense of gratification to the woman. Perhaps the doctor was gratified as well. Like many male gynecologists of his time, Parvin raped his female patients by digitally examining them, induced orgasm, and then claimed their bodily response as proof of a woman's sexual disease or deviance. Such women then became forced candidates for drug treatment and bodily mutilation, and a fit subject for an asylum. But when institutionalization, or packing a woman's vagina full of cocaine, failed to quell the appetites of the nymphomaniac or masturbator, Parvin advised, the question of removing the ovaries is to be considered, and we must ask the question whether we can thereby cure the disease. This operation is becoming so extremely fashionable that I imagine after a time but a small portion of our women will be childbearing. Perhaps that was the point. And in case ovarectomy was contraindicated or unsuccessful, Parvin then declares, clitoridectomy might do good in some cases. When all other means have failed, we would be justified in resorting to it. In such claims, male physicians hold the power to decide if, when, and how a woman's body is to function. Containment and control of bodily pleasures are used to control the woman herself, while reducing her body back into the solitary function of procreation, but then only for those women deemed as worthy candidates of reproducing. The female body itself becomes colonized, and a colonized body is a pinnacle for social control. Third, we have the timing of Parvin's publications, especially his 700-page opus magnum, The Science and Art of Obstetrics, replete with graphic illustrations, along with the unveiling of his justly celebrated life-size, anatomically correct female mannequin used as a teaching tool about female labor and delivery, both of which appeared soon after he left the prison. Unrestricted access to hundreds of despised women and girls who no authority would have believed or cared had they complained would have provided him ample research subjects. And isn't that really the only good explanation for why the president of the AMA was there in the first place? Our third protagonist is Dr. Parvin's nephew, Amos Butler, one of the founding fathers of eugenics in Indiana, the first state in the world to pass a compulsory sterilization law authorizing the forced sterilization of institutionalized people believed to be unfit for procreation. As a young man, Butler was an accomplished zoologist and ornithologist, but soon switched his focus to total institutions and their inmates. He was the founding secretary of the Indiana Board of State Charities and the Indiana Commission on Mental Defectives, as well as president of the American Prison Association. For at least a quarter of a century, no one had greater influence over total institutions in Indiana than Amos Butler. His zoology background no doubt primed his interest in theories of biological determinism and two highly influential pseudoscientific sociological studies, the Jukes and the Tribe of Ishmael, which purported to find inherent human degeneracy and criminality. Because of these ideologies and studies, the promiscuous woman became closely associated with both criminality and hereditary feeble-mindedness. Immoral women came to be viewed as the diseased fountainheads of corruption, polluters not only of their own generation, but potentially the next. Butler used his scientific knowledge in conjunction with the ideas of hereditary depravity and criminality in his quest to eliminate defective people as a means of social hygiene. He found a close ally in Dr. Henry Sharp, the physician at another Indiana prison, this one for men. Beginning in 1899, 8 years before Indiana's compulsory sterilization law was passed, Sharp began performing eugenic sterilization on prisoners, eventually sterilizing 465 inmates. It is imperative to acknowledge the specific bodies that Sims, Parvin, and Butler used to develop science and medical practice, and how that legacy has been and continues to be used to manipulate and control women. Gynecology and obstetrics were not founded by or through empowered women, nor did Sims, Parvin, and Butler indiscriminately use women of every race, class, and social position to advance their careers in medical science. They used black female slaves, poor immigrants, incarcerated women, and eventually all institutionalized women. All such women were expendable, not even valued for reproduction. The female slaves that Sims acquired for his medical experimentation had lost their ability to labor or sexually reproduce due to their gynecological infirmities. And it was only at this point that they then became economic burdens and therefore expendable commodities, which then made them optimal subjects for medical experimentation. The same could be said about women who are incarcerated, insane, of limited intellect, or who, by nature of their circumstance and biologically determined inferiority, lack personhood. Because experimental surgery could very likely result in extreme pain, permanent disfigurement, and/or death, a person deemed to have been of inherent worth and economic value, or who possessed legal personhood, would not have been used. In 2005, medical ethicist L.L. Wall defended Sims' contribution to medical science, arguing that the 4 years of experimental surgery Sims performed on black female slaves, quote, represented his attempt to cure them of an odious and devastating condition that was then considered incurable, performed explicitly for therapeutic purposes, with the patient's cooperation and consent, end quote. Wall would have us believe that during a time of chattel slavery, black female slaves took precedence over white women as the most viable recipients for therapeutic medical treatment, or that slaves had the option to refuse at all. They did not, just as institutionalized women and mental defectives have no right to refuse. This deliberate indifference to how medical advances in science have been made and which bodies were used to do it has allowed the continued medical experimentation on vulnerable bodies. Apologists for Sims, Parvin, Butler, and their ilk failed to address the fact that the claims of cooperation and consent are derived solely from the words of affluent white men whose personal and professional success were contingent upon their claims. Sandra Lee Barkty argues Foucault's failure to discuss modes of biopower that are peculiarly feminine in the categorization of human bodies as objects to be manipulated and controlled. Quote, To overlook the forms of subjugation that engender the feminine body is to perpetuate the silence and powerlessness of those upon whom these disciplines have been imposed." End quote. I contend that gynecology and obstetrics are among the ignored feminine modes of biopower, and that deliberate indifference to medical bioethicists, to the experimental use of female bodies, bodies of color, enslaved or otherwise, is in itself an extreme form of women's subjugation. Judith Butler's Precarious Lives questions: who counts as human? Whose lives count as lives? For all three of our protagonists, determining whose lives count applied as much to race as to gender. Intersections of race and sex create a space for classifications that are used to assert social control over targeted, inferior populations. Liddell McWhorter, analyzing Foucauldian genealogy, states, quote, "Race and sex intersect primarily at points where people think in terms of normality and abnormality or deviance, where people have major managerial goals for large populations, and where there is a strong desire to control human development. When it comes to race, nothing more needs to be said of Sims, who freely tortured slaves. Parvin, on the other hand, practiced on both black and white prisoners, despite Indiana's 92% white population. He clearly included racialized and masculinized descriptions of female sexual deviance. He described nymphomaniacs thusly: in nymphomaniacs, we generally find a coarse skin, large lips, black eyes, black hair, dark complexion, and a more or less rigid and contracted prominent condition of the muscles. There is usually less fat and connective tissue, so that on the whole the body is more angular and less rounded than in the perfect woman." Parvin's medical textbook further asserts anatomical racial difference, adding to the beliefs of the hypersexualized embodied black female, claiming, "The length of the vaginal canal varies in different subjects and at different ages. It has been stated that in the negress, this canal is longer than in white women." Robin Wiegmann's American Anatomies argues that the anatomies of blacks and women assert visual economies to circumscribe the, quote, "political innate rights of man and the subsequent rise of the human sciences," end quote. Wiegmann's theoretical wedding between race and gender anatomies exposes the ways that white racial supremacy is reconfigured beyond slavery and segregation. I extend her theories of reconfiguration to include the links, and indeed the continuum, between the institutions of slavery and mass institutionalization, and how the criminal label marks the body for expendable commodification. Incarceration is but a shift from slavery into penal institution, designed for physical segregation and disenfranchisement, that targets and contains blacks and women in disproportionately large numbers. The negative label and the stigmatizing social taint of criminal convict or felon creates a new reconfiguration of inferiority, which in turn constructs a new devalued lowliest level within the social hierarchy, a convict race that is completely stripped of personhood, rendering them disposable human capital, a body to be used, profited off of, and then discarded. Within the reconfigured convict race, women of all races and social class meld and become particularly vulnerable to scientific medical experimentation and to heightened levels of social control. Gynecology served a dual purpose for social control. First, through the direct bodily subjugation of the woman who personally experiences medical control over her sexual and reproductive anatomy, and second, through the sacrificial experimental use of her body to learn ways that all women's bodies may be controlled. Male fears about both women's fight for equality and women's sexuality and reproductive capabilities fueled male elites in science and medicine to seek ways of maintaining control over women's bodies and their lives. The scientific study of animal evolution and husbandry transferred into ideologies of racial and gender hierarchies, which then transferred into medical theories and practices designed to control human anatomy. Through medical methods of bodily control, a superior race could be propagated, while inferior races could be eliminated, or at the very least, permanently locked into classifications, segregating those people via varying forms of social control. This hierarchical labeling of human being, particularly the ultimate assertion of inferiority assigned through the deviant or criminal label, perpetuates an endless continuum of disposable, expendable, rapeable bodies that are permanently subjugated for the advancement and betterment of the elite few at the apex of the hierarchy. Yet these patriarchal ideologies and practices have not solely been the dictates of men. As my colleagues Kim Baldwin and Michelle Jones discussed in detail, white women, particularly the early feminists of religious propriety who exemplified the cult of true womanhood, such as Quaker reformer Sarah Smith, were equally culpable. By segregating women in separate institutions, an ample space has been provided for new colonies of exploitation of female bodies and expanded levels of social control over women. Our nation's first women's prison housed only 17 women when it opened in 1873. Today, there are over 115,000 women incarcerated nationwide. 1 out of every 3 women incarcerated in the world is incarcerated in the U.S. Parvin had only a few hundred women at his disposal for medical experimentation to perfect the science and art of obstetrics. Today, obstetrics is a multi-billion-dollar medical industry affecting the lives of women worldwide. Perhaps positively for those women who are fortunate enough to afford and have opportunities and a choice for quality medical care. But far more often, negatively, for disposable, institutionalized women who remain the last candidates for quality gynecological and obstetrical care. Science and medicine could not have advanced without the vulnerable bodies of slaves, poor immigrants, and institutionalized people. Vulnerable bodies are the first candidates for medical experimentation and the last candidates for medical treatment. The failure of intellectual elites to expose and condemn historical medical experimentation and the sexual conquest of incarcerated women allows such practices to continue today. Paradoxically, reliance on professionals as arbiters of truth while ignoring the voices of the victims provides an ongoing legacy for bodily control as our most extreme but routinely used means of social control. I want to close with a final vignette about our good Dr. Parvin and on what his mentor Sims hypothesized as a condition he called vaginimus, that likened a vagina to a mouth and throat, susceptible to a condition similar to laryngitis, that would cause the vagina to swell and constrict, and then potentially hold captive whatever had been inserted into it. Parvin confirmed that the vaginal orifice has the power to either prevent the introduction of the penis, the speculum, or even the finger, or may prevent the withdrawal of the penis. Parvin solidified this latter claim by publishing a case study of penis captivus. He received the fabricated story in the mail as a ruse by a disgruntled colleague who signed it for authenticity using the equally fictitious name and title, Egerton Y. Davis, Esquire, U.S. Army. The farcical story was supposedly an eyewitness accounts of servants who had become stuck together during sexual intercourse due to the powerful muscular contraction of the woman's vagina trapping the man's penis and holding it captive. Despite the sheer ridiculousness of the penis captivus phenomenon, Parvin's case study served as truth in the field for the next 100 years. For those of us who actually have vaginas, intrinsically know what utter nonsense this is. But women's words about their lives and their bodies, enslaved, incarcerated, or otherwise, are almost completely absent or discredited in the historical record of female medical science. Perhaps by some strange irony, the primordial fear of women holding men's penises captive provides an unconscious justification for a male-dominated criminal justice system that holds women's entire bodies captive. Thank you.